I'm Lindsay Hall.
And I'm Esther Wielden.
Welcome to All Things Sustainable, a podcast from S&P Global. As your hosts, we'll dive into all the sustainability topics that are reshaping the business world.
Join us every Friday for in-depth analysis and interviews with leaders from around the globe. Together, we'll break down big sustainability headlines and cut through the jargon.
We're back and nearly recovered from a very busy Climate Week NYC. Last week, an estimated 100,000 attendees convened in New York City across more than 1,000 events. And as we'll hear in today's episode, momentum grew in 2025.
Each year, the nonprofit Climate Group organizes Climate Week NYC in partnership with the UN General Assembly and the City of New York. And in 2025, events focused on 10 broad topics: energy, environmental justice, finance, food, health, heavy industry, nature, policy, sustainable living, and transport. And these were all under a banner theme, Power On. If you tuned into the podcast last week, you heard our special daily coverage on the ground. We were downloaded about 12,000 times last week, and each episode featured a different CEO and highlighted a different key theme from Climate Week. We talked to the CEO of Climate Group, the CEO of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, or WBCSD, the CEO of a circular fashion startup backed by Patagonia, and the CEO of global disclosure platform CDP.
I also sat down last week with Daniela Rake, the interim CEO of global nonprofit Conservation International. And Esther, I'd like to just share here that I received one of the nicest testimonials about our podcast that I've ever heard from Daniela. Here's what she wrote on LinkedIn, quote, "It's one of my favorite listens each week because it brings together voices from across our field. In a space where it's easy to stay focused on your own work, this series is a chance to look up from our foxholes and learn from the perspectives and experiences of our friends and colleagues," end quote. And I just love this because it is exactly the mission of our podcast, to educate listeners about sustainability topics across silos. Climate Week is a great place to hear from many different perspectives. It brings together stakeholders from the private sector, governments, nonprofits, and the climate community at large. And we conducted dozens of interviews last week, many of them at the Nest Climate Campus, where the All Things Sustainable podcast was an official media partner. We'll be bringing you all of that great coverage in the coming weeks. Today, we're featuring an interview I did with one of the world's largest banks. I sat down at the end of Climate Week NYC with Heather Zichal, Global Head of Sustainability at JPMorganChase.
A couple notes on things you'll hear Heather mention. She talks about 2 EU sustainability reporting rules: CSRD, that's the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. She mentions a voluntary carbon market transaction the bank did with Chestnut. In August, JP Morgan led a $210 million credit facility for U.S.-based Chestnut Carbon. That's a company that generates forced carbon removal credits.
She also mentions her colleague, Dr. Sarah Kapnick. Dr. Kapnick joined JP Morgan after serving as chief scientist at the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. During her tenure at NOAA, Dr. Kapnick was a guest on this podcast, and we'll include a link in our show notes. Lastly, Heather talks about COP. That's the UN's big annual climate change conference of the parties. In 2025, COP30 will take place in Belém, Brazil, November 10th through 21st. Okay, here's our conversation, where Heather starts out by explaining the bank's Climate Week NYC presence.
JPMorganChase was really excited to plug into over 20 events here throughout the week. In fact, there were a lot of questions about earlier in the year, how big will New York Climate Week be? Will people show up? Will there be a lot of programming? And we know that over 100,000 people actually came. There was a really strong showing, a lot of really important conversations on the topics that we grapple with every day, whether you're a policymaker, a regulator, entrepreneur, or in the financial services sector like me. So I think if I were to boil down what are some of the key takeaways from the week, the first is you can't have any conversation about climate and energy policy in the U.S. without talking about AI. Obviously, the recognition that the energy demand associated with AI is really causing people to think differently about growth in the power sector, about the trajectory of emissions in the power sector, and what are the roles that everyone plays. I think that conversation around AI, what does it mean, how do we plan for it, is certainly one very strong thematic. The second is really around resilience and adaptation. As we are seeing more and more severe weather events impacting our clients, impacting our communities, the conversation is now pivoting to what are the things that we need to collectively think about and how do we work effectively together to solve for those things in a world where there's not a perfect solution, right? Like insurance and homeowners are a perfect example. A lot of conversations on those topics. And then the last piece of it is just, I think there's a very healthy dose of pragmatism that has been layered into the conversations, which is like, okay, there are a lot of things outside of our control, like technology cost curves, like federal and state policy that are going to impact our decarbonization pathway and the speed with which that happens. And so we need to recognize there are things that are outside of our control and be clear and very crisp about what each of us is doing and why. So I think those key things, AI, resilience and adaptation, and sort of pragmatism around the broader climate agenda is really what I'm taking away as three of the key themes from this week.
And I think our listeners will be really interested to hear about all of those topics from JPMorgan, right? The biggest bank in the U.S. Everyone's kind of looking to you as a bellwether for how the financial industry is going to move on these topics. Adaptation and resilience in particular, we'd love to dig in. How is JPMorgan approaching that topic?
Well, I think as a bank, you think of everything through the lens of what are the opportunities and what are the risks. And for us, it's all about how we serve our clients, right? What do they need? What are they seeing? As I mentioned, one of the topics that's very much front and center right now is this conversation around homeowners insurance. What does this look like in the future? Whether you're worried in the state of Florida about sea level rise, or you are in California and you're worried about wildfires, there's a very healthy recognition that we are going to collectively need new products, services, and policies to help meet that moment. And so while I think it's very hard for me to sit here today and say, oh, three things, like these are the three solutions.
Right.
We're seeing this be part of an ongoing dialogue because these are really tricky, thorny issues to figure out and resolve. It's not going to be one bank. It's not going to be one government. It's really going to take collective action to find the kinds of solutions that our clients are going to need, that our communities are going to need. So being part of this dialogue, being part of these conversations is very important so that we at the bank can get ahead of the curve. We can make sure we're tracking the issues that are very salient and most important, and that we're being part of the discussion about how we find solutions.
Okay, and just to really break it down for our listeners, the way that I understand it is that as these extreme weather events become more frequent and more severe, thanks to climate change, insurers are either raising the cost of their policies on, for example, homes, or they're pulling out of markets full stop. And that has obvious implications for a bank, because if you can't get insurance, then a bank is not going to write a mortgage on a home.
Exactly.
Am I understanding that?
Yes,
sort of
100%, right? And candidly, I spent time earlier this year in LA meeting with policymakers, meeting with people impacted by the wildfires. And those conversations were very interesting because as JPMorganChase, we're the largest bank for the state of California. We are the bank for the insurance companies, and we provide a lot of mortgages. So we have a lot of skin in the game and take the challenge very serious. And to my point, it's like whether that's here, whether that's the time we spend engaging with our clients on the ground, we are here to be part of the conversation and to think strategically with our partners about solutions.
Okay, and you have a policy background. Can you tell our listeners about that and tell me, how does that help you prepare to kind of navigate this environment?
Yeah, you are correct. I've been in the energy and environmental space for 25 years. And prior to coming from JPMorganChase, I ran a trade association that represented wind, solar, and battery storage companies. And prior to that, spent a lot of time in the U.S. government working on energy and environmental policy. And part of, I think, what makes me helpful and successful at JPMorganChase is so much of what is happening in and around the broader energy and climate conversation today very much dovetails with policy at a federal level, at a state level. And because we're a global bank, we also are thinking about like what are the regulators and new policies coming into place in the EU? What are the regulators and policymakers in Asia Pacific asking for and looking at? And so being able to be conversant in the policy conversation is very helpful, but it also helps us glean specific insights that we can then share with our bankers and ultimately pass on to our clients as they're trying to make decisions, as they're navigating and trying to understand what are the policy implications of the One Big Beautiful Bill, for example. Us being in a strong position to know kind of how Washington works is, I think, really helpful to our clients and puts us, as I said, in a strong position to be able to decipher, what government action is going to need for the broader agenda.
Any key policy developments that you're watching or that you think our listeners should sort of be keeping their eye on?
Well, there's a lot happening, but to name a few things, I think in the EU, there's a very healthy conversation happening around disclosure and how some of their climate disclosure laws ultimately get implemented. Those are affectionately referred to as CSRD and CSDDD. I think in Asia Pacific, there are more and more entities at a country level that are pushing companies like ours to write a transition plan. So how are we thinking about the energy transition? What does that mean for us as a firm? How does that impact the conversation and the thinking that we have around some of our own targets, whether that's financed emissions targets or the $1 trillion in green that we've committed to by 2030. And then in the US, I think the really hot topic right now, where certainly there was a lot of conversation here, is siting and permitting. There's broad recognition that if we want to deploy more energy to meet AI demand, we're going to have to build out the grid. Well, that's been really hard for us to figure out how to do as a country.
Yeah.
So how do we follow the conversation both in Congress and within the administration about the tools that they are planning to deploy to make that permitting process smoother, more transparent, and to move with quicker decisiveness? Because so many companies, you waiting 10 years to get a permit to build a utility scale solar farm is a long time to wait. So how do we work collectively to find ways to improve that siting and permitting process? I think those are the things that I'm watching and will continue to watch in the weeks and months ahead.
Okay. And in this current landscape that you're describing, one thing that I'm increasingly hearing is the term economic resilience in the context of sustainability conversations. Wonder how this fits in with what you're hearing, and what does this term mean for JP Morgan?
When I think about economic resilience, I think about how our infrastructure is dealing with the effects of climate change. So again, as we were previously talking about, there's massive challenges in adapting to the effects of climate. So we're working every day to figure out how we can help our clients understand risk and opportunities around that adaptation. And, I think the important thing to remember is that it's going to look different depending on where in the country you are, right? Because managing for wildfire risk is very different than managing for sea level rise or intense hurricanes. So there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think the direction of travel is not going to get easier. It's going to get harder and more complicated before it gets easier. So really focusing on planning for the future, both to mitigate risk and to capitalize on strategic investment opportunities, are kind of at the heart of economic resilience. And I think the verdict there is increasing ROI to economic resilience.
Okay. I also hear quite a bit about the need to balance sustainability priorities with considerations like affordability, energy security, energy access. Can you talk to me about how that comes up in your role? How is JP Morgan thinking about that?
Absolutely. And it's a great question because, as I referred to, one of the key takeaways is being pragmatism. It really is about how do you balance the three legs of the stool. one being climate, but also two being affordability, and three being energy security. And that's very much at the heart of a lot of these conversations. And then you see, conversations around Russian gas, for example, really driving a geopolitical strategy for the EU. And I think how we work collectively to balance those three things is going to play out in real time. My colleague, Dr. Sarah Kapnick, recently issued a paper on energy security. We hosted a dinner to talk about that. More and more, these energy issues are really becoming global security and geopolitical issues. And I think for the foreseeable future, that's kind of the trend that we're going to continue to see.
And so in that context, how do you support clients? How does JP Morgan support its clients on their energy transition journeys, keeping sustainability in mind alongside those other pillars that you talked about?
Well, I think we are providing advice and financing solutions to clients based on the objectives amidst market cycles and changes in political dynamics. Our approach to sustainability is rooted in a two-prong approach. First, it's about leveraging business opportunities, and second, it's about managing climate risk. As the world's largest bank, we've got a commercial interest in avoiding the worst outcomes of climate change. So we work with our clients on this issue every day across the firm, in every part of our firm, in every part of the world.
Okay, great. So if we take a bit of a step back, I'd like to look at this whole topic just through a bit of a human lens and ask, how are you navigating, or how are the sustainability professionals that you work with navigating this current landscape, which has some definite headwinds if you work in climate or if you work in sustainability?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there are definite headwinds, but a couple things remain true. One, the business case on renewables is incredibly strong, and that's not going to change. So in many ways, we are in a much stronger position than we were even 5 and 10 years ago. If you look at the cost curve, if you look at, what is being deployed globally between solar and renewables, like they are on top. So I think we start from a position of strength. The second thing that I think is important is it was never going to be a linear path to trying to rewire the entire way we create and make energy. And so if you thought that there weren't going to be major bumps in the road, you were kind of kidding yourself a little bit. So I think we've got to remember that the road is going to be bumpy. We're going to try things. Some of them are going to work. Some of them are going to fail. That's okay. But most importantly, as professionals in the sustainability space, I think remaining nimble is really key. Because even the things I thought as the global head of sustainability were going to be my priorities in 2025 didn't necessarily come to fruition, right? I mean, we very much found ourselves in a world where we had to think very differently about, where do we see the priorities and what does my team and I need to focus our time on. So that nimbleness, that being creative about how you can plug in and find the opportunities, whether that's with the clients or working with governments, the need is certainly going to continue to be there. And that's where I think the opportunity lies.
You're definitely speaking my language. We're all about being nimble on this show. And, we've kind of followed conversations where they lead. And like you said, it's not always where you would expect.
Right.
Have you come out of Climate Week 2025 with any new or surprising ideas?
The short answer is yes. And candidly, there's a lot there to process. But I will say some of the conversations that we have had about how can JPMorganChase be a stronger player in voluntary carbon markets and thinking through different ways to partner. I was lucky enough to join both Microsoft and Chestnut in talking about a really exciting deal that we did for nature-based solutions. And so we're kind of building our muscle memory there, and I want to continue to pursue that work and continue to work with large corporate buyers and figure out if there's some way that we could expedite a blueprint for deals like the Chestnut deal on a go-forward basis. I think the other interesting piece of the puzzle is to go back to one of the key themes, adaptation and resilience, unlocking some of those conversations at a deeper level with policymakers, with insurance companies. It's just been a strong reminder that we need to have a seat at the table. We've got a lot to do to represent our clients, and we have a lot that we can offer in terms of potential solutions. So those are two of what I'm sure will be a much longer list by the time I finish my mental download from Climate Week 2025.
It's a lot. The other thing that you had talked about, AI, I just wanted to ask what JP Morgan's sort of headline approach to AI is. What are the big things that you're thinking about when it comes to AI?
Well, I mean, we think about a couple things, right? First is growing energy demand means that we've got to be ready to work with our clients and to think about, where are those business opportunities, whether that's new nuclear energy, doubling down on renewables plus storage, thinking about the role natural gas plays. And I know across the firm, we're working with our bankers, recognizing that, again, there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. But I also think when you take a step back and you look at the opportunity for renewables plus storage, I think there's a really strong and exciting path there that's going to allow us to continue to help us meet our own internal targets and decarbonizing our power sector financed emissions, but is really going to be important as we think about meeting increased energy demand over time.
Okay, thank you. Well, Heather, I've asked you tons of questions. Anything that I haven't asked about that you wanted to talk about or you wish I'd asked about?
I think it's worth noting that Climate Week is an important step in the journey to the COP30. And obviously, that's another area where JPMorganChase will be keen to follow the conversation, follow the discussion. It's going to continue to be an important platform to engage with our clients, policymakers, and partners on global multilateral climate dialogue. So that's kind of the next thing on the horizon as I'm thinking about the rest of my year.
I'm glad you bring that up because I've heard a little bit of mixed messages about how companies are thinking about their presence at COP30. And some are maybe pulling back from where they were in years past. So it sounds like JP Morgan will still have a presence. And
JP Morgan will have a presence. And I think it's exciting to think about the fact that there's maybe not just one opportunity in Brazil. I think more people are looking at events in Rio, Sao Paulo. Obviously, we will be doing that as well. But it just underscores the importance of this dialogue, the fact that even though, the times are more challenging, there's just as much interest and it's as important as ever to continue that dialogue.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for sitting down with me here.
Of course. Thank you.
So today we heard how climate momentum and decarbonization efforts continue, even as there's this rising focus on adaptation and resilience. Heather said a very healthy dose of pragmatism has been layered into climate conversations. She also talked about the central role of insurance. That's a big focus for banks as climate change makes extreme weather events more frequent and severe. She acknowledged that we're going to collectively need new insurance products, services, and policies to address climate change. We also heard today how AI and energy are redefining the geopolitical landscape. Heather said you can't have any conversation about climate and energy policy in the US without talking about AI.
Please stay tuned for more of our coverage on these big themes in upcoming podcast episodes. We'll also include a link to subscribe to our weekly newsletter if you'd like to stay up to date with sustainability developments. It's called the S&P Global Sustainability Weekly, and the same team that creates this podcast puts it together each week.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of All Things Sustainable. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, share, and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts.
And a special thanks to our agency partner, the 199. See you next time.